welcome to episode 8 of That 60s Recording Podcast. I am your host, Joe Montague. Can't believe we're on episode 8 already. Where has that time gone? That's 4 months I've been doing this now. Wow. Okay, so today I am chatting to Rich Pagano, who is a drummer from New York City. He plays drums in the Fab Faux, who are a Beatles tribute show. I'm sure you will have all have heard of them, but they are a Beatles tribute show who they don't dress up; they just replicate the recordings live, essentially. And Rich also runs, or used to run, as you'll hear, a course called The Art of Vintage Drum Recording, which was one of the main reasons I wanted him to come on and chat, because I thought it'd be really interesting to hear about his ideas on that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's quite a technical episode. Rich is a wealth of knowledge on this subject, and there's some pretty specific drum knowledge. As I said, it's a pretty drumtastic time for the podcast at the moment. You'll hear that the next episode is drums as well. But I hope that you enjoy listening to it, because I know a lot of the artists I work with, even if they don't play drums, they enjoy hearing sort of drum conversation. I think drums can be a bit of a mystery. I mean, they're a blooming mystery to me, but I think they can be a bit of a mystery to people. So I hope that you enjoy listening to it, and I hope that it gives you some good advice on how to get great drum sounds or placements, or it's just interesting. So anyway, I'll stop waffling, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with Rich Pagano. So today we're very lucky to be joined by Rich Pagano, who is, among other things, a drummer, a studio owner, a producer, a songwriter, and you seem to have so many strings to your bow. And the thing that brought you to my attention was your work with the Fab Faux, and that's why you run a course at NYU called The Art of Recording Classic Drums, which I also thought would be very interesting to hear about. So that's the reasons why you're listening to Rich. So thank you for coming and speaking to me today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. And thanks for the resume. The only difference would be is I'm no longer a teacher at NYU. I did it for about 5 years, and then I had a very busy schedule. I'm not saying I'll never do it again. We're always talking. But that's the Clive Davis Institute of Recording in New York City, and I have an interesting story of how that started for you, if you'd like. But I think that between COVID and scheduling and also the type of courses that they're offering now, I took a bit of a break. But I love teaching, and I think that is one of the most progressive schools that a young engineer could go to.
I mean, if they're covering real specific things like the course that you run, we'll talk about it a little. I mean, there's no reason why we can't talk about it now, but it covers a very specific 20-year period, and if they're focusing even in on recording drums specifically in that specific 20-year period, then they do seem that's really progressive, and that's incredible that they're doing such a great thing, or were doing such a great thing.
Well, I would say that as far as being progressive is that they do they have to be textbook, because I'm assuming that parents, I shouldn't assume, I know for a fact that parents like to know that the kids are opening books. But what I liked about the administration over there is they have a nice mix of classic instructors and also younger hit producers and instructors who can also bring what's happening sonically these days, to the textbook portion. I mean, hip hop really is a force to be reckoned with. I learned so much these days by listening to how young hip hop engineers are balancing their mixes and how they're using frequencies. But I think the 20-year progression of drum sounds, that was for the most part my class. I was using an umbrella of, I would say, late 50s Rudy Van Gelder, which is a New Jersey studio that made a lot of great jazz records for Blue Note Records. And Rudy had an incredible way of making his room sound much bigger than it was, and just really great sense of balance on drums. It became a template for a jazz drum sound. I then go to a Motown sound, which is for the most part a jazz sound, because they really were jazz drummers, the Motown drummers. So they would bring their kit or tune their kit at the session the way they would normally tune their drums, which was kind of high pitched. I then would take the class, and this is every week now. We would go with a different era. I would then take and I also would call interviews, and a few of the engineers that I'm showcasing within certain timelines, I had interviewed or spent some time with, so I was able to give firsthand info if they were forthcoming. But after Motown, we would go into I would say we would do a little bit of what was starting in rock and roll, maybe early Beatles and Stones, and then right to Glyn Johns, the Led Zeppelin sound, and then Abbey Road. We'd spend a full day on the Abbey Road sound. And unfortunately, I got to know the late, great Jeff Emmerich fairly well. And Jeff and I had a few conversations, and we also did a session together with the Fab Faux. We did a tutorial with him. And he was totally cool with me picking his brain and bringing in certain photos, asking if they were real session photos or if they were, as he would put it, promo. The Beatles would come in, and he would just place mics around instruments, and it looked like it was a session. And I said, well, how would I know the difference, I asked. And he said, after the first few records, they didn't feel like they had to dress up anymore. So if you see them in the studio dressed up, working, it probably is a photo shoot. But he really helped me with understanding tone and how to use your ears, spending as much time in the live room as possible. So Abbey Road is towards the end of the course, and then beyond that we go into the 70s, and I'm a big Bill Szymczyk fan. Of course, Bill did Joe Walsh records and the Eagles, and Face Dances by The Who. And I also love the sound of Gus Dudgeon's records, so we would spend a bit of time with the Nigel Olsson sound, which kind of a quintessential 70s drum sound. And the final class would be a hybrid. I would have the students pick what they love from each era, and we would make our own drum sound. And of course, I had to keep it modern, and I had to show them how to make libraries of kick and snare drum sounds and placing them into a grid. Just so, because most of today's engineers, when they're young, they're in their bedroom and they're creating beats. They're not necessarily getting a drummer to do the session. Having said that, they needed to know how to get those sounds, and in my opinion, not always rely on a sound library to get a drum sound. But if I'll make a long story short, the way I got the gig was, I make most of my living as a drummer, although that seems to be changing as I become busier as a mix engineer and certain levels of production in the studio. But I was called for a Motorola jingle in New York City, and the producer also asked me to curate musicians and the gear. So I got the right players, and I contracted the right amps, and I brought a 1961 Ludwig drum set with correct heads. And these two young engineers come out, and they start miking the drum set up, and we all knew that it was a British invasion type sound, early 60s, which is why I got a little ahead of myself, why I curated all of that gear, or advanced all of that vintage gear. The young engineers come out, and they start putting up stereo overheads and snare top and bottom, and close 421s on toms. And so I said, this is not going to get us the sound that we want. We're going for a British invasion sound. And they turned to me and said, we only know this drum making setup. And I asked them where they went to school, and they told me, and I said, let's talk after the session. But right now, let me go look at the mic closet. So the producer let me go in his private stash. And, of course, he had old German mics and RCA mics. And I said, I'll take that, and that. And we did, like a mono overhead with an RCA, like a Fell mic right behind the floor. I'm not sure if we even mic'd the snare. A couple of Coles mics out in the room. I had them monitor it in mono and just kiss it with a plug-in Fairchild compressor, and it sounded great. And so the kids come in and they start dismantling the drum set, the mics on the drum set. And I said, you really should spend a bit of time in the golden age of recording drums. And they said, yeah, we wish that our school had taught us more about getting creative in the artistry of recording drums. And I asked where they went to school, and they told me. And yes, it was the Clive Davis Institute of Recording, which I still would say is progressive, but really how much time can you spend on getting drum sounds? But it was important to me. And I contacted the school, and the director heard me out. And after that, I started teaching there. And I never really was planning on becoming a teacher at a university. I would teach in my studio, small groups. But I love it. I love teaching the art of getting drum sounds and looking at it like a painting, and really understanding where the tone is coming from and how phase can make a drum sound so beautiful, and not relying on compressors, not relying on outboard gear or EQs, and angling mics and finding where the puff of air comes out, which is not something I thought up, but it's a theory that really does work. Anyway, I've given you tons of stuff here.
Yeah, I'm spoiled for choice as to where to go now. I'm like a little kid in a sweet shop. So I'm just thinking, I'm thinking about where we should focus on. I mean, we may as well continue talking about this because it's where we're currently at. I mean, I watched some of the snippets of the course on your website, and something that comes across. It's come across there in what you've just been talking about is just how passionate you are about getting these sounds. Your attention to detail is unbelievable, and you really are like buzzing to speak to the students about it. I mean, the clips are a couple of minutes long, and I was hanging on your every word every time.
Oh, thanks. There's so much information on a drum. From the rim to the center of the head. And there's so much, in my opinion, all of the EQing is right there. Your low end is going to be at the rim or the hoop, and your high end is going to be more towards the center, especially with a kick drum. And I love that theory. Oh, my goodness, the name of the book just escaped me. There's a great book out there. Making Music? No, it's not Making Music. Maybe it'll come to me. Where, I guess this works for guitar amps and for drums, of course, is that when you tune the drum correctly, there's going to be one part of that head where all of the resonance and all of the beauty is going to come together, and it's just going to sort of flow out like a waterfall. And you could feel that with the back of your hand. If you move your palm along the rim, you suddenly feel a puff of air. That's where your microphone should go. Have a guitarist play a power chord, turn the amp up a little bit, and check for where that puff of air is coming out. The speaker is kind of showing you, and the drum is showing you where it wants to release the tone. And for years, I wondered why I couldn't get good tom sounds, because I was putting it in a part of the head that was kind of working to make a different part of the head speak. And once you find it, sometimes you have a little too much tone, but then you have to get into the art of angling your mics and bringing either in more high end or creating a mid sweep. But yeah, I'm fascinated by it. And so you talk to engineers, and I'm also an engineer. But when I'm on a session as a drummer, I'm usually hired to also get deep into the drum sounds or get into a period sound. Not always. And it's amazing how many engineers and producers will say most drummers don't know how to tune drums. And that's a big part of my class too. Is we spend a whole day on the variables of tuning a drum, top head and bottom head, and types of heads, and yeah. So I love it, and I actually just built a remote studio. We have a weekend house in upstate New York, and of course I need to send drum tracks, back to the city for session work, and I have a great room up here that I didn't really know existed when we bought the house, and by creating building a small studio here, I'm looking forward to starting my classes up here, because the drums just sound so beautiful in this room up here. Anyway, once again going off on tangents.
It's cool. Growing up, I've come to recording personally in the last. So very seriously in the last, say, 3 or 4 years. And previous to that, it was just being the drummer in a studio. And you hear about, I heard people talking about the sweet spot and never really pictured it as a real tactile thing, a thing you can feel with your hand, a puff of air, like you're saying. I really enjoy how you're demystifying that process. It's almost... obviously it's an art, but it's almost scientific, and you can produce the same results by following a method to an extent.
Yes, by the way, the book is called Mixing with Your Ears. And the two revelations for me, I recommend that book to everybody. It really is a great Bible on getting creative and understanding how a room also reacts with a drum. And that was one. And the other was talking to Jeff Emmerich. And Jeff was the first engineer that I saw put his ear right next to the hoop, right next to the shell. And there's actually one photo of Ringo, and I don't think it was a Beatles session. It may have been a Jackie Lomax session. But Jeff decided to put the microphones at the bottom head. And I showed him the photo, and he said, well, I must have taken the heads off. I said, no, you didn't. And then, he had a bit more clarity after a while and said, because I must have put my ear down there and just loved the tone of that bottom head. And the point was being realized by the large diaphragm tube mic that was over the toms. And once I tried that, where I did a mono overhead, usually about forehead height, and also, with small diaphragm microphones, cardioid mics at the bottom of my toms, I suddenly got the Abbey Road sound in a big way. I'm not sure if he had done that on Abbey Road, but it was a good way for me to sort of have all of the tools to really create that sound or realize that sound. And just knowing that, and also with cymbals, he would walk past a cymbal and just sort of go up and down with his ear and then place a mic right there. That was so groundbreaking. He was the first one that I had heard about, and that most people tell me, to bring the mics in that close. Ken Scott took it even further. Ken brought larger diaphragm mics from the photos I could see and from listening to him, larger diaphragm mics further in towards the drums and the amplifiers, which has a lot to do with the sound of the White Album.
It's, previous to Jeff Emerick, I guess Abbey Road's mic techniques, they were all done by the technicians. They'd have come in their coats and done it all with measuring tape, I'm assuming, and it was all really prescriptive. And I guess Jeff came in and completely changed it. Just decided he wanted to do what he thought sounded best rather than what the Abbey Road manual said.
Well, I think Norman Smith, the original engineer, who I thought was also somewhat creative, but being a bit more textbook, and he was Jeff's guru. But I guess, Jeff just would roam around and see, okay, I see how that sounds, but if I brought that in further, I bet it would sound like this. And then when Norman split and the Beatles had carte blanche in the studio, and they also would ask Jeff, from what I've heard, they would ask Jeff to not make anything sound like the previous record, at least from 66 on. You got to get creative, and that meant, just throwing the book away, throwing the textbook away.
I wonder if you might not know the answer to this question, but there's one photo I've seen of, I'm sure it's a session that Jeff Emerick is engineering, where there's two kick drum mics. It's quite a well-known photo. You may or may not have seen it. I've seen it around a few times, but from what I can gather, there's never been two kick mics. It might have been one of those sessions that you were talking about, a promotional session, which I didn't know existed until you just told me then. But I don't know. Have you seen that photo?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was a revelation when I was young and I saw that photo. And I believe in, most people use more than one microphone on the kick drum. But I also find it very easy to have one mic that's usually a large diaphragm mic that finds the sweet spot near the shell. That's going to be your low end. But if you really want that point and don't want to rely on your compressor to get it initially, although I think he did use cardioid mics, but I tend to use a dynamic mic that I slowly move with in-ears in. And we should talk about getting drum sounds with in-ears at some point. I'll find, I use my palm and I'll find where the air is sort of bellowing out at the edges of the shell. Low end is right there. I need some point now. Take the dynamic mic. It could be a D112. Well, I'm not sure how deep you want me to get into microphones here, but it could be a pointed mic. It could be a 57, and just start moving that towards the center where the beater is, and make sure your phase is right. And there's your EQ. When you get back in the control room, you have your low end and you have your high end. And if you have too much honk from that 57, I find if I angle it down a bit or bring it a bit lower below the beater point. And by the way, I'm talking about a Beatle kick drum sound, which is front head off. It's a bit of a different story when you have a hole in the drum. This is a single-headed kick drum. Angle it down a bit, and now you create a mid-sweep, and you get rid of your mids. You just don't do it and then go back and listen. Hopefully you have a really great pair of cans that are very tight to your head. Or, in my case, I always use in-ears. I spent the money on in-ears. And I actually would tell my students, when getting drum sounds by yourself, it's very important to forget about maybe one expensive microphone that you would like to have in your arsenal, and maybe put $500 towards a pair of triple driver molded in-ears that are made for your ear canal, and then get a couple of those shotgun headphones and put them over it. I always get drum sounds with in-ears now. I always bring an extension cable so I can move around the drum set, and I tell the engineer, what mics I want on, and we kind of add as we go along just so I can hear phase. But with in-ears, also years of experience of knowing what drum sound I want when I walk into a studio. It's incredible how quickly you can get drum sounds. It's also incredible how obvious it is where that drum is singing or where that drum needs some surgery and tuning or a fresh head or whatever when you put in-ears in. Of course, if I'm the producer and I'm able to stay in the control room and I have an assistant out in the room, I can then have that person move the mics around and watch me, and then when I say stop right there over the talkback, it's the same thing. But if I'm out in the room, I have to do it with in-ears, and I'm always successful.
I've spent a huge amount of time with my in-ears in trying to do exactly what you're describing, and it's when you're not quite sure what you're doing, it's quite hard. But then once you get used to it, it does. You're right. It's you almost forget what the sound in it sounds a bit counterintuitive to what you just said, but you almost forget what the sound in the room is like, and you just end up focusing on what's going on in your head, in your ears. And you're right, it does make for a much better sound on the record when you're able to do it that way, rather than sort of doing a recording and then having to go back and listen to it through your speakers and then back and forthing that way is a real pain.
And I'm not saying that I get it right, and then we hit record. Sometimes I do have to go and retweak. Like the phase could be a bit better on a certain microphone, and that's by going in the control room and listening to it over, flat speakers. But I have to add, it also has a lot to do with sitting at a mixing desk and hearing drums soloed, and how you react to that. So I do want to hear that when I'm out in the room getting drum sounds as if I am sitting there at the desk, obviously. But my method is, work with the drum and tune the drums, and start with the kick drum. I have everything muted. I start with the kick drum. I usually start with the ambient or the low end mic, the resonant mic. If it's a double-headed drum with a hole or without a hole, start with that mic, get it where I like it, then have the engineer unmute the secondary mic, and I find the point with that mic, angle it if I think it's too mid-ranging, because I can't stand the sound of a mic that's in the center of the kick drum. I think it's just phasey and just not really the way a kick drum ever sounds when you hear it on a recording. Once I get that right, I then go to the snare drum, and just with I have the engineer unmute it and get a certain level out of it, usually fairly loud, or louder than where the kick drum is for a minute, and just move it around and just see where that drum sings. I find lately that when I point the snare drum mic towards the tom shell, the rack tom shell is reacting with more overtones, and I tend to leave it there. I almost never, unless it's a 70s sound with a lot of baffling on the snare drum, I almost never have the snare drum mic closer than 1.5 inches. I can't, because I can't use a snare drum mic that is right on top of a head.
No.
I almost always have a snare bottom mic. If it's a fairly modern session, I know as a drummer what that head is doing, and if I'm also mixing it, I know I'm going to use some of it. Mm-hmm. And then I go to hi-hat, if we're using the hi-hat. And then I usually go right to my overheads and get them together, and get the full spectrum of the set that way. And I don't rely on overheads just for cymbals. I tend to keep my overheads fairly wide so that I get a wonderful in-phase snare picture too with the cymbals, just so I can use the mics for more than just cymbals. Unless, if it's a really quiet 70s thing, then I'll have the mics primarily for the cymbals. And I'm talking about something that's a little more 60s sounding, but it has to be used in the modern realm through most of my sessions, where it's vintagey, but we're recording it for maybe a new artist. So this is one specific thing. I then mute the overheads, and then I go right to the close mics on the toms if I'm using them. Make sure they're in phase. Make sure that the tones are the equivalent, and also find that air, find that sweet spot with the air. And if there's too much low end, angle that mic away. Angle it away from where the closest cymbal is, of course. Now I have my overheads muted still, so now it's a close mic sound. And make sure that the close mic sound is as pro and beautiful as possible, just in case we decide that we don't want to use a lot of ambient sounds. I find that when I mix a record, a lot of times people spend way too much time on the beauty of the room. They don't spend enough time on the idea of maybe just using the close mics, and the close mics just are full of overtones and fatigue and whatever. Got the close mics happening. I then go to my room mics, maybe a mono overhead or what's out in the room, or, usually a large diaphragm or ribbon mics. Get them into a level of beauty. I usually start from one side. The other side is muted. Then go to the other side and move that so the stereo spectrum, if I have it panned, just you can tell when it just hits and gives you this beauty of a room that's totally balanced. Bring back in the overheads, get a little balance, and that's it. If the drummer is good and consistent, I usually don't compress anything except for maybe a little bit of bus compression on a master in Pro Tools or outboard. I tend to not print it. And that's my sort of generic new and old. But we haven't even touched on tuning or the types of heads. But a lot of that information, point being, a lot of that information has come from Jeff and talking to Elliot Shiner. And also Lynn John's book has a lot of information, too. I love that Lynn John says that he never used tape measures. Really?
There's a video on YouTube of Glyn Johns explaining his technique, and he is I don't know what the right word is for it, but he's quite the word I'm going to say is blasé, although that seems a little bit too crude. Feels a bit unfair, but he is quite free about where he puts the mics.
You're saying he also says nothing about measuring, right?
Yeah, he kind of just says use your ears, like what you're saying, basically. Put one here, put one over here, move them around a bit until it sounds really good, and then there you go.
Yeah, I mean, someone like Glyn Johns, who has done an incredible amount of sessions, I do find that after a while, you kind of know where to start. If you know how the drums are singing in the room, you kind of know where to start with your maybe ambient mics or mics that aren't so close to the drums. But Glenn's story on the Led Zeppelin sound was funny. It was a revelation in that he talks about all these videos on YouTube, people using the measuring tape, and he laughs at that, and he said it's not how it happened. I mean, I'm sure a lot of your listeners know the story because it's been out there for a bit, but to make a long story short, and this is tons of information too, is that they had just done a Led Zeppelin session, and he actually had, even though he was running it most likely in mono, he actually had stereo overheads. I shouldn't say that. He may have actually had the kit on one channel and then kick drum on a different channel, which I know he had done with other bands. Anyway, so he's got stereo overheads. They get the take. And then Jimmy Page decides to add an acoustic guitar track. And the assistant brings if you're a drummer's point of view, he brings the overhead large diaphragm mic over to Jimmy, right overhead. So it was the overhead over Bonham's ride cymbal. He brings that over to Jimmy, who's sitting in front of the drums now doing an acoustic guitar overdub. And Jimmy does the take. They want to move on to a second track. They put the mic back where Glenn had it as an overhead over the ride cymbal, but the engineer doesn't tighten the boom stand tight enough, and the thing starts to slide down, and now it's kind of sitting outside of the floor tom, but it didn't totally come down to the full boom extension and pointed towards the floor. So Glenn starts pulling the drums back up to get back to basics, and doesn't really notice that the mic isn't where it should be. And I guess Bonham got back on the kit and starts playing, and he notices something's different and liked it, liked the presence of that mic being over there, and just panned the overhead left, it's over his rack tom, and panned the one that's sort of just beyond the floor tom right, kick up center. He's not sure if he used much of the snare at all. And it suddenly had this full spectrum and air. He said he tweaked it a little bit, moved it slightly, maybe for phase, and he loved it. He loved that it just solved the drum, the way Bonham tuned his drums in such an open way. And so he used it, I guess, on more Led Zeppelin sessions until Eddie Kramer came in. And used a whole bunch of mics. I actually worked with Eddie fairly recently and was able to pick his brain about Led Zeppelin sessions.
Cool. I hadn't heard that story. I have to admit I'm a bit late to the party. I haven't read Glenn's book yet. It's on my pile of books to read. But I hadn't heard that story. That's really that's pretty incredible story. And
by the way, it's such a great place for a floor tom mic if you tune your drums like a jazz drummer. If you don't have any baffle or very little baffle, and you have a lot of tone, a lot of resonance, it's such a great place to put a microphone, even if you're using close mics on your toms. I do that. I don't always put the mic back there, but I try to get it in as often as possible. These days, I do a lot of drumming for an American TV show here called The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. And you guys, do you know that over there? It's on Amazon.
The name rings a bell. I haven't watched any programs on Amazon, but I think if you told me what the plot was, I'd know what it was because I've heard the name of the show.
Well, I don't have Amazon, so I've actually never seen an episode, but I do know that it's about a housewife who becomes a stand-up comedian, and she just changes her life by getting into the entertainment world. It's wildly successful here,
right.
And I work with the production team on other TV shows, and I'm fortunate that the producer, the musical supervisor, is a fan of my drumming, and it's a lot of Hal Blaine and the early '60s drumming, and I tend to be called not only to play on the episode music, but to also, get the correct sounds, and they rely on me for that, which I'm grateful. And I just did a COVID, sort of ISO session, because, normally I go into a studio in New York City, and we try to record it, they record it like an old New York City session with everybody in the room, an orchestra, and a rhythm section, almost like an old Phil Spector session, which is such a great experience. Having said that, there are more episodes to finish, so they sent me a whole bunch of basic tracks that I had to add drums to, and I did it up here right after I finished my sort of building my studio, my control room, and I used the Glyn Johns method. I asked them if they were cool with me getting creative. I used the Glyn Johns method to record those drums, the drums up here, large diaphragms on the overhead of the rack tom, same mic behind the floor tom. Within ears found the sweet spots. I was able to do it myself, actually, because I don't have an engineer up here. Mm-hmm. Luckily, my wife was here. If I did have like a kick, I needed to move a kick drum mic and call her downstairs to kick it while I got that sound. But yeah, whatever it takes. But the point being, I did also, just in case they'd wanted something a little more close and intimate, I did put like small cardioid mics on the toms, and also for point in case they wanted that. But I love that miking technique, and I know that you wanted to talk about the Fab Faux, and we can, but I can tell you that we go nuts with drum sounds in the Fab Faux. Between my drum tech, my front of house engineer, and myself, I get there super early, and the Fab Faux, it's a giant production, and we use 2 drum sets on stage. Early and late, we do one drum set covers 63 through 68-ish, and then another drum set covers Abbey Road through Let It Be, and a bit of the White Album. And we mic them up, and we spend a lot of time. With the later years kit, it's close mics, it's T-towel drums, correct drums, it's darker cymbals. The mics are a bit more into the kit, but the early years kit at Stage Right is the Glyn Johns method, which he was in on Let It Be. He did use that mono overhead, but we really make sure that it sounds like an early Beatles record with shimmery cymbals to make it sound like the overheads are doing more work. Maybe but no baffle on the drums, double-headed kick drum. And we have a great time. And we're doing it for so many years, but we still enjoy solving it every week. Our engineer.
Sorry to interrupt you. I love it. That was gonna be one of my questions. Actually, you answered it. There's a video on YouTube. It's I came across it from your website of you guys playing at Beatle Week in 2014. And you had 2 kits there, and I was going to ask whether that was a special, but you guys play with 2 kits all the time. Well, say you play with 2 kits all the time on that show.
Yeah, we do. Actually, we just changed over. I think the era of the 2 kits in the Fab Faux is taking a break for a bit. But I do want to talk about the 2 kits because it's been quite an education in getting studio drum sounds for a live application. And I was going to say my engineer, Joe Chinisi, who is he's an incredible musician. He's got incredible ears, and we're so lucky to have him because he's a geek like us for all Beatle nuances, and he actually loves getting drum sounds. And he tolerates, my anal retentive proclivities when it comes to getting drum sounds, and also my drum tech Neil Nunziato, he also seems to dig it. So the 3 of us get deep in it. The 2 kits. The only difference now is that I decided that I want to maybe do the next couple of years with one hybrid kit that can handle early and late. Because I just want to change it up for myself. So the second kit is becoming a arsenal of floor toms because Will and I do a double drummer thing doing Strawberry Fields. And for those that don't know, the outro of Strawberry Fields is Ringo on drum set and John Lennon on floor tom. And you can tell in the anthologies that John is on floor tom because you hear him talking in the studio as it ends. So we're going to play that up, and instead of having a second drum set, where for the last 10 years or so, Will and I have traded with drum sets, and we've actually gone to each drum set where we kind of walk across from each other, and he goes to later years, I go to early years, and vice versa. So it's all entertainment. But I asked Will if he would be okay with doing a similar thing, but me and he going to the floor tom station and playing that up, almost like the Beatles recording on steroids.
That's cool, really cool. So you are using double floor tom now instead. It's something. So I play in a Beatles show too, and one of the things we struggle with is one of the things I struggle with is getting that sound, the early sound and the late sound. So I've ended up somewhere in the middle, finding a sound that works for everything, and then putting the T-tails on for parts of the later sound, which is, it's all a compromise. But I admire that you've managed to find people that you're working with and have the patience yourself to make it work live. I mean, that's why you guys are so renowned.
Yeah, it's nothing like us. As look, we certainly are religious to the intricacies of Beatles music, and I think we were the first ones to really get into the correct voicings and the overall mood of the approach, and really dissect it. But fortunately, we're all good enough musicians where we can dissect it and put it back together, and still inject a bit of ourselves into it to make it, also a show that goes beyond just replication. And I'm very proud of what the five of us have done with the Fab Faux. I mean, we still play some of our shows with horns and strings, and that's where it really is untouchable. But I mean, we as a five-piece, it really is a great band. With Jimmy Vivino on guitars and keyboards, and Frank Agnello, who plays rhythm guitar, and Jack Petrozelli on keyboards and guitars, and then of course Will Lee, who asked me to do it. Will plays bass and guitars and keyboards, and there's so much personality in the Fab Faux. And as diligent as I am with getting drum sounds, these guys are the same way. The correct guitars, tweaking the amps to sound right. But we certainly depart from the Beatles sound every once in a while, and I think that has a lot to do with our success, because I think when people come to our shows, they know that it sounds like a Beatles record, but then for a little while it might sound like a Who record, or it might sound like an Albert King record, or Little Richard, because we try to stay with their influences, but someone like Jimmy Vivino, who is an incredible lead guitarist and really comes from the blues, comes from pop music, but his guitar playing is steeped in the blues. So he'll always inject that into Beatles music maybe a bit more than George was, because George wasn't really a blues player. But people realize this, that Jimmy, he's playing like George, but he's injecting an additional real element, which is the blues. And you can't go wrong with a blues influence.
I think that might be... I really admire that you guys have the confidence in... I'm trying to choose my words carefully. Like, in the confidence in your success to inject your own personalities in, because I think coming from the world of Beatles tribute, it can feel a lot of time that there's pressure to replicate exactly, when really that's not what it should be about. I mean, if you want to hear the Beatles playing exactly, go and listen to anything that they've put, listen to the studio records, or go and listen to the BBC sessions or something, if you want to hear the Beatles doing it. And if you're going to recreate it, you may as well enjoy doing it and not be a stickler for everything needing to stay precisely within the constraints of what would have been in that era, and just enjoy yourself. And I think the audience no doubt will get on board with that, and that's a huge contributing factor to your guys' success.
I'm glad that you feel that way. It's not always the case with purists, of course, and we've certainly been criticized for, as time went on, our personalities sort of rising to the top of the sound. But it also has broadened our audience. I mean, we really don't get Beatle tribute fans that would go see like a 1964, and they just want to feel like they're watching the Beatles. We get classic rock fans, and we get audiophile fans, and we certainly have Beatle tribute fans. But I think that we're a bit of an anomaly in what people are soaking up when they come see us. And I have to admit that, I tend to push the envelope more than anybody else in the band. I have a really hard time with replication. I fought Will on being in the Fab Faux initially because I was afraid of having to replicate something that was so precious to me, or even just replicate in general. And but Will saw something in my playing. We had been touring with the late great Hiram Bullock, a New York guitarist in Europe, and Will just heard a lot of Ringo and Jim Keltner in my playing, and he asked if I'd like to start a Beatles band with him, and I said, nah, not really. And that makes Will want to do it even more. So he called me every week for a bunch of months, and I said, man, I've been watching this guy. I'm not a lot younger than Will, but certainly when I was in college, I watched David Letterman every night for years, and I loved his playing. I loved that band, the house band on the early Letterman, in the early Letterman years. So, why would I not want to play with Will? Plus he's arguably, one of the greatest session players that has ever lived, and there's obviously going to be something to learn by working with him. But I think after 20 years, I'm the one who kind of departs and throws maybe something else in on the drums a bit more than the rest of the guys. But I think it makes them react a certain way, and I think the audience appreciates that we are not staying by the book. I mean, Will stays by the book. I mean, Will has an agenda, and I respect it. But when Jimmy takes a solo on an outro, we tend to extend outros, and Jimmy then becomes himself. And I love those parts of the show as much as I love when we get deep into like the mood of Come Together or Tomorrow Never Knows, like the record. But I love when we suddenly become ourselves and give the audience that side of us. But I still feel, for me, it's, let's say they toured today and they all were alive and they did have extra musicians in the band. How would we play it? And how would we get it out to the rafters? And that makes me play it a bit more dynamic sometimes, or it makes me throw some of my other influences in there. And like I said, I think I said, we're doing it for like 22 years.
Wow.
How much longer can I, be a great replicator and not, jump off a cliff? No disrespect, but, that's just me.
I think that, it will be obvious from anybody that knows you guys and from listening to this conversation that, you're clearly extremely well schooled in what's happening in Beatles music. So if anything, that does give you a platform to take it further. That's the reason that you can take it further, and then start injecting your own personalities in it, is because you're not doing it as because you can't play the originals. You're doing it as a way of building on it for you personally, not building on it as in trying to build on the musical legacy or anything like that. But I think you're allowed to get away with it because you do understand the intimacy of what's happening in those records so well in the first place.
We do both well. We do Beatles well, and we do a band well, a band that listens. Everyone has great ears, and, when we're not doing this gig, we're all busy doing other things, whether that be backing up other people or even being in a house band for a big event in New York where you have to change gears for every artist that might be on the bill. In New York, when there's a music scene, of course, right now we're down to zero, which is a real drag. But there's a lot of benefits, and some of us in the Fab Faux get called because we're known to sort of be able to turn corners quickly and also morph into the type of player that's needed for a multi-artist bill. And I think that musician is the type of musician that is always listening and always sort of going with what's happening on stage rather than what's happening on the record. And some of the Beatles bands, they have a mission that they're going to play the stuff like the record, and that's fine. There's room for everybody. Or some of them can only play like that, and they don't stray because it may affect the show. It may affect the show in a negative. I love that we all had a similar record collection growing up, and and we can certainly pick and choose from all of those influences.
Yeah, it definitely works for you guys. So, what's your? How do you decide what albums to play? So I noticed on the shows that you go and play out, you're either doing like a greatest hits mix, or you're doing songs from songs from Rubber Soul and songs from Hard Day's Night. How do you who gets to decide what you're doing that night?
We all decide. I manage the band, so I'll and once we get the contracts and the financials in place, we then talk about theme. So if it's an annual that we do, we'll look at the history and see what we haven't done there in a while. And sometimes it's a mixed show. If we've done a couple of records, let's say we did Abbey Road 2 years ago, and we did Revolver last year, well, this year we go back and we call it a glorious hodgepodge. Someone may have actually given us that term, but that could be everything, and that's usually big productions or big Beatles productions or stripped down early stuff, and the set culminates usually with a big piece like the medley on Abbey Road side 2, or A Day in the Life, where you're using everybody, horns and strings. If it's a new market and the financials aren't what they will eventually be when you establish an audience, we'll go in as a 5-piece, and we will play a lot of early stuff, but we'll also incorporate a lot of the material that maybe isn't giant. Like we probably wouldn't play. I don't actually. We do just about everything now with that. We wouldn't do Martha My Dear because that's so horn and string centric. But we certainly will. We might do Strawberry Fields. We'll keep Walrus in because Jimmy plays orchestrations and Jack plays Wurlitzer piano. So we're able to sort of, even though I know it's not real instruments, we uphold a certain level of spontaneity and intensity to keep it in the set list. Having said that, when we do Walrus with the horns and strings, it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, I can imagine having a live band there must make a huge amount of difference to the sound of that song particularly, let alone others.
Yep. Yeah, I love our rock and roll shows too. Every once in a while, we'll just go back as a 5-piece, and we're like, I remember one year we did. Remember doing like the Hollywood Bowl show. And just a night of early stuff, and then we embellished it maybe with a bunch of encores that may have had some stuff from later years. But, I think because we solved 66 through 70 in the first 10 years of the band, we then started going back. And we always say it that the early stuff is harder to play than the later stuff because you have to have that youthful exuberance. You got to think like a teenager playing your instruments again. And I love that. It kept me in touch with, bit of a haphazard, Ringo in D.C. energy, which that's great drumming.
It's crazy, isn't it? I mean, he's wild during that show. It's like genuinely wild. Some of what he plays is insane.
I know, and it's funny. People say, is he really a great drummer? Yeah, he's great, and he wore many hats. He could be an arena rock drummer like that, and push the band, and also create a template for playing like that. And then he can go in the studio and take direction and create these wonderful singer-songwriter parts that, are just honoring the vocal and then be involved. Jeff Emmerich told me that Ringo always tuned his own drums. And the drums always sounded great, like he really had an ear for tuning also.
I didn't know that. That was, funnily enough, I was having a conversation with an artist I was working with recently, and we were chatting about that exact thing, and I didn't know. So that's really interesting that he tuned his own drums.
Yeah. That's about him tuning his own drums, and the poor lad having to do so many takes that, there were wood sheddings always at his feet.
Do you have a...
No, it's funny.
Sorry, go on.
Go ahead. We worked with Jeff. Like I said, we did a tutorial in New York years ago. There was a studio that's no longer there called Legacy Sound Studios, and it was very similar to... It was more like Studio 1 than it was Studio 2. Mm. It was a big room, and we brought the right gear, and that was my first time working with Jeff, and it was a full day of just incredible information. And we were going for Hey Bulldog, so we got the drums right, and I brought in photos, because that session is documented. They did record that session. It was used for another video when it came out. It was used for Lady Madonna. They used the footage of Hey Bulldog of them recording it for a Lady Madonna video. 90% certain it's Lady Madonna. And we didn't know that till, recently. But now we know that they did a multi-camera shoot for Hey Bulldog. Having said that, there's your information in that video for how the drums are mic'd. And how the drums are T-toweled. So we emulated that, got the drums right, and then we start playing, got the amps right, we start playing, and Jeff is recording us, and keeps stopping me. I start the count off and get into it, and he stops. He goes, "Hey, Rich, would you mind hitting the kick drum a bit harder?" I said, "Yeah, okay." And 3 more times this happens. "Hold it, Rich, you really need to kick it harder." Now, I forgot this one point. I advanced a lot of the gear for that day. I through his manager, was able to get Fairchild compressors. That may have been it. And microphones, certain microphones for the drums and amps. So by the 5th time, finally, and my leg is about to fall off now. I'm hitting the kick drum so hard. And we get the take, and we go in, and I go over to him, and I ask, "Jeff, why did you want me to hit the kick drum so hard?" And he points to the Fairchild compressor. And he says, "You see that compressor?" He goes, "I set it a certain way, and I need the drummer to hit the kick drum hard enough to fatigue the tubes at a certain amount. With that compressor, have the Beatles sound." So he's honoring the gear before he's honoring the drummer, which is such an incredible idea. And I thought, right, of course, you can't turn the input up. It's not the same thing. You have to fatigue the valves at a certain level for it to sort of have that pulsating sound that is all those great kick drum sounds that you heard on Beatles records. And so, I just love that, I had that information right there.
What an amazing story. What an amazing experience to work with someone so closely connected to that history.
Yeah. I'm sad to say that. I was one of the last people to see Jeff. He came to a Fab Faux show in L.A., and he and I hung out after the gig, and he said, "I really would love to do something with you guys." And then he said, in particular, me, as far as drum sounds. He was at our sound check. I believe he was at one of our sound checks, and he saw the effort that we put in to drums, and he and I would chat about what I love about getting drum sounds. He knew I would pick his brain, and he wasn't always forthcoming. He could shut down with people, but somehow he liked me. So at the night of the gig, he said, "Why don't we talk?" And I said, "Well, I'm leaving in 2 days." He said, "Well, I'm doing a lecture in L.A. This California show. I'm doing a lecture in L.A. I think it was the next night or 2 nights later." I said, "I'll be there." And he was very tired at the lecture, and it ended, and I went over to chat with him, and I thought to myself, "Oh, this isn't a good night to talk about what he and I could do together in a lecture series, either with the Fab Faux or whatever ideas he had for he and myself." So I said, "Why don't we talk this week? Thanks." And he died that night.
Oh man. Yeah, that's a I know it's a sad story, but it's a really special story. And yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. No, that's a yeah, I'm not quite sure I don't have many words for that. That's amazing.
Because I was very lucky to have him in my life, and also I'm grateful that he noticed my passion for it all,
Yeah.
and would hear me out, on how I incorporate his techniques into everything I do.
Yeah, I mean, given the passion that you have for this, there probably isn't much of a greater accolade than to have had some like a admiration from Jeff for what you're doing. That's amazing. So yeah, that's an unbelievable story.
And by the way, when we did that this lecture, musical lecture in New York City, I don't think he had done a Beatles drum session set up in a long time, and he fought me on it. So, this kid coming in, I mean, I wasn't really a kid, but I was, I guess we're going back like over 10 years. He saw me come in with my, I'm getting beat, but I'm not going to. Saw me coming in with my photographs, and let me get rid of this person. Hold on one second.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah, no problem.
Anyway, all right. So I forget where. Oh, yeah. So yeah, he fought me on it. He fought me on setting up in a Beatle format, because I said, "Well, why are you putting those mics up there?" And I advanced these microphones that you used at Abbey Road. And he kind of gave me a look like, "Oh, well, why don't we go for a modern sound of a Beatle?" And I convinced him with his assistant to please think in terms of, the late '60s. And I almost feel like maybe he hadn't been doing it anymore. That we were one of the first sessions he had done where he was revisiting a Beatles setup, and then since then he had done it plenty because there was this whole renaissance of Beatles recordings, and anyway, so I'm glad that he gave in to me.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's very cool. What was it that you were working on that day?
Yeah, that was this sort of it was a weird thing. It was this organization in New York that wanted to bring. They charged a lot of money for people. And not even a lot of engineers, just a lot of very wealthy Beatles fans to watch how a Beatles session may have progressed. And they were able to afford Jeff and afford us, and we just spent the day with a bunch of rich New Yorkers watching us record. And there's a small video of it on YouTube, recording with Jeff Emmerich, that I think someone in the organization had put together.
All right, I'll check it out. I haven't seen that. I won't take any more of your time. I know you're really busy. It's been such a great conversation with you. Like, thank you for being so open in sharing all your stories and your knowledge. And I could chew your ear off forever on very small details that probably only you and I are interested in.
Well, I appreciate it, and I know you said you wanted to talk about my stuff too. I just want to add that I'm really busy finishing my second record of original music, and it should be out this fall.
So the band's Sugarcane Cups, isn't it?
Yeah, Rich Pagano and the Sugarcane Cups, and I like I said, I have a recording studio in Midtown in New York City, but now that I'm staying away from New York City. I'm able to do mixing up here, and up in the Hudson Valley, New York State. And so it's interesting how the recordings are sounding a bit different. It's okay, and I'm looking forward to putting this out there because it's got an interesting theme on what's been going on in the world and in my life in the last couple of years. And it's a rock and roll record.
There's some incredible drum sounds on the first record. I had a listen through before I spoke to you, and the sort of breadth of drum sounds is pretty large. They change quite significantly for each track. Obviously, there's a unity to the sound, but you do go deep into different drum sounds. I think, and they all sound amazing. There is a big weighting towards great drum sounds on that album.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Well, what can I say? I hope this one is as sonically pleasing. I feel like Ringo when it comes to my stuff. I really don't want to. I don't want to grandstand. I just want to support the songs. So I hope you like it. I will make sure you get a copy as soon as it comes out.
Oh, thank you. I look forward to it, and I'll put links to the first album on the show notes. And there's a few other things that you've mentioned in this chat, and I'll put links to those as well as links to your website. So there we have it. And as usual, I hope that you enjoyed listening to that conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. We continued to chat for a little while after that, but it was just nonsense chat, so I faded it out. It's not always easy to get a clean sign off at the end of these, because they are just chats. I'm literally just calling them up and having a chinwag. Next week's episode, next fortnight's episode is going to be with Gordon Elsmore, who's the drummer for the Bootleg Beatles. Another really interesting conversation. Gordon's obviously a wealth of knowledge on Ringo, and it was actually suggested by a listener that I get in touch with Gordon, and we chat about some Ringo stuff. So that's what I've done. So that's what's coming next time. I'll put links to all of the things to do with Rich, and there's a couple of things that he mentioned in this episode that I will link to in the show notes. So if you want to catch any of that, then scroll down. As usual, if you want to get in touch with me, if you've got a suggestion for people that you think it would be good for me to chat to, then give me an email on joe@allyouneedisdrums.com. You can visit my website, allyouneedisdrums.com. For more information about the things that I do. There's the isolated drum stems that I send out. The one that I've just done this week was Come Together. So yeah, you can check all of that out. There's a full archive of all the stuff I've done so far on there. And for set general sessions and that kind of stuff. As usual, I want to say thank you to Joe Kane, who provided the intro and outro music that I absolutely adore. And my other good friend, David Henshaw, for the beautiful artwork he provides every episode. And that's that. So until next time in a fortnight, have a good couple of weeks. Goodbye.